Bay Area has always been known for its shipyards and shipbuilding. With the escalation of World War II and the impending direct U.S. involvement in the battle, President Roosevelt requested an initial 50 cargo ships to be built to aid Great Britain. In 1940, the small industrial town of Richmond, California, was chosen as the site of the first Kaiser shipyard and was charged with delivering 30 of the 50 cargo ships. Seemingly overnight, Richmond became home to thousands of workers who came from all over the U.S. to work in the shipyards. At the prompting of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, production of shipbuilding was stepped up to meet the demands of war, and it was Henry J. Kaiser who once again stepped up to the plate. Yard number 2 was built specifically to construct Liberty ships, and Yard 3 and 4 soon followed with the acceleration of the war. It was also here that new opportunities opened up for people from varied ethnic backgrounds, and women became 1/4 of the shipbuilding team. With over 100,000 employees working here at the Richmond shipyards by 1943, this once peaceful landscape of Richmond, California changed forever. Of course, housing was very limited in the town of 23,000, so overnight a trailer city had sprung up to house the new Kaiser employees. The seemingly impossible task of building these huge ships known as Liberty ships was taken to a new level as Henry J. Kaiser developed the concept of modular shipbuilding. It was here in Richmond, California that 747 Liberty ships were built for the war effort, and Kaiser went down in the pages of history for producing a Liberty ship in an amazing 4 days. It was here that the U.S. Naval Air Station was constructed in Alameda, and it was built on reclaimed land at the west end of Alameda Island. This was the site of the USS Hornet CV-8, as she was loaded with the 16 B-25s that took part in the Doolittle raid, striking the Japanese home islands during World War II. Then the USS Hornet CV-8 met her final match. On October 26, 1942, the Hornet was in a fight over the Santa Cruz Islands off the coast of New Guinea, close to Guadalcanal. It was here the Japanese dive bombers and kamikaze pilots took the Hornet to a watery grave. But that's not the end of the story for the USS Hornet. The 8th Hornet, CV-12, was launched 30th of August 1943 by Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia. The Hornet CV-12 went on to be part of some of the most difficult battles at sea during World War II, so perhaps it's only fitting that this part of history would come home to rest at the U.S. Naval Air Station site at Alameda Point. Peacefully retired, she is now part of the nation's legacy of aircraft carriers. And today we're going to take you behind the scenes and back in time to learn more about this grand old ship and talk with the men who served on the Hornet and continue to be part of her ongoing legacy. Rolf Saby was part of the richest moments of the Hornet's history, and today he's going to take us behind the scenes at the helm of the Hornet. Rolf, that's the bridge, and you were here for Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Tell us a little bit about what a quartermaster does, because it has a lot to do with that bridge.
Sure does. That's the area that I used to work. Up on the bridge, quartermasters were responsible for the safe navigation of the ship, and worked under the jurisdiction of the navigator, who was the department head for the navigation group.
So really, that's where you drive the ship?
That's where you drive the ship from. As I said, we were all qualified to navigate and work all the equipment on the bridge, and we were all qualified helmsmen as well.
You know, when I think of the wheel, I always think of that pirate ship wheel, you know, with the spokes and all that. This is a little different.
Yeah, this is a little different. I think those spokes went away a few years before this ship was built. This is the helm, and obviously where we steered the ship from is the primary steering control for the ship. There are a few other places aboard that you can steer the ship from if something should happen to the bridge.
Now, this actually steers the rudder, or do you have more than one rudder?
No, this steers the rudder. It's a single rudder, and it's an electromechanical device, so it's not a direct connection or a cable connection that converts to electricity and then back to mechanical power through hydraulics.
Okay.
And actually turns the rudder.
Now, these look like compasses, am I
Yeah,
right?
these are both gyro compasses, and you steer steer by these instruments. As you can see from our room here, you can't see where you're going.
Right.
You don't need to. You're given directions as far as degrees from the command staff, and you follow these gyros. You do have a magnetic compass if you should lose your gyroscopes, but they're not nearly as accurate as gyroscopes, and so normally you would follow the course that you've been given. Right. By paying attention to your gyro.
Now, this was as high-tech as it got, right?
This was as high-tech as it got during my time and during the Hornet's time. It's a little more sophisticated nowadays.
Well, this was kind of interesting. Now, do you really talk in this?
Well, that's an old boy's tube. There's two of them, and if you had to close up the bridge in a situation such as general quarters, a combat situation, then they could actually talk through this tube. The tube goes out to the bridge. It also goes down below to the flag bridge. But in our time, most of us had sound-powered telephones, and so we would have a headset. And if they needed to talk to us that way, they would just talk to us through the headset. Under normal seaman conditions, whoever was in charge of the bridge, whether it was the captain or an officer of the deck, he would just stick his head through the porthole there and he would tell us what
That's an even easier way to do it.
That's the easiest way.
So what do we have here? This looks like something right out of a restaurant or a movie.
Right out of a restaurant, right. No, not quite. This is the engine order telegraph.
Okay.
And it's also called a lee helm. This is what tells the folks in the engine room what to do.
Okay.
This is you've probably seen it in movies, all ahead 2/3.
And I always hear a bell that goes with that.
That's right.
Does it really do that?
There is a bell, and there's a bell that sounds down in the engine room as well to make sure that we get their attention. And they would then answer the call, and we would see that response on an arrow here, knowing that they're now going to follow the new direction. If we didn't get that response, we could actually ring an alarm down there, which would get their attention even further.
Now, how do you know how fast you're going?
Actually, the officer of the deck has a speedometer, if you will.
Okay.
It measures knots, which is the nautical term for miles per hour. It's knots. And they can see out there how fast we're going.
Now, what kind of training goes into this type of a position? I mean, this is really a big position. You're steering a huge vessel here. What kind of training goes into it?
Yeah, there were actually two levels. During normal steering, if you're just cruising from here to Hawaii, a straight line, the bosun mates would usually steer the ship, and they had to have 50 hours of training under the supervision of a qualified helmsman, usually a quartermaster. The quartermasters were trained to a higher level and were considered to be master helmsmen. And that was because the only time that we actually went on the helm was during unusual circumstances. Heavy seas, taking fuel from another ship where you're sailing about 100 feet apart in almost in a pattern, entering and leaving port, and of course during Apollo 11 and 12. We were the ones that did the training and learned how to bring the ship up next to the capsule and actually bring it to a stop and not run over the darn thing, which would have not been too good.
It wouldn't have been a good day at all.
Not a good day at all. So anytime there was a situation out of the ordinary, the quartermaster would steer. And the quartermaster was required to have 250 hours of time on the helm under those types of circumstances before they would get that certification.
Oh, that's a lot of training.
That's a lot of training, but it's also, as you said, it's a big ship.
A lot of responsibility.
Most of those circumstances were the type that if something went wrong, people would get hurt. So.
Now, what's the highlight of your career as a quartermaster? Was it Apollo 11 and 12?
Yeah, I'd have to say it was. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. I'm not quite sure when we were 19 and 20 years old that we realized how important and significant it was. And we realize it now, of course, when we look back. But it was, and we realized that we were doing something pretty big. We had just come back from a Vietnam tour. We had come back to Long Beach in May. We had gotten our new orders for Apollo. A new captain had come aboard, Captain Cyberlick. And in late June, early July, we headed down to Hawaii and began our training with a dummy capsule, learning how to pick that capsule up and, as I said, not run it over. And then, of course, towards the end of July, we headed 1,500 miles south to an abort area if something should have occurred. And we sat there, and then another 300 miles north to the initial splashdown area.
Well, next I want you to show me this high-tech gear that actually you used during that time period, because nobody's going to believe this. So let's go into the nav room, and we're going to find out how you did it.
It's really interesting.
all three American carriers, in Hornet, in Enterprise, in Yorktown. The young and the brave prepare for battle. Some will fall in flames from the sky they seek to dominate. Some will perish in the ocean, whose mastery they seek to win. But the ritual of launching takes its disciplined course, as precise and ordered as a ballet.
The National Radon Test is about to begin. Radon enters your home from underground. Some people are immune to radon. New homes can be built to protect your family from radon. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer. You can call 1-800-SOS-RADON to find out how to get your family's home tested and made safer.
You chose to trespass on the railroad tracks. This is the next 60 seconds of your life. A message from Operation Lifesaver.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Northern California Journal. Today we're at Alameda Point, California, home to the USS Hornet CV-12 Museum. Beginning her career in 1943, the USS Hornet played a major role in World War II. She took part in 59 major battles and helped turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. And then she went on to serve in Vietnam and also as a recovery vessel for Apollo 11 and 12. Now today, it might not sound like it would be too difficult to maneuver a ship to where a space capsule would splash down. But remember, we live in an age where GPS and other high-tech gear is common. Back in 1969, it had to be done a lot differently. And in this portion of our show, that's exactly what we're going to learn from the man who made it happen with absolute precision. Ralph Sabey was aboard the Hornet as quartermaster, and he was at the helm of the Hornet when the Apollo recoveries were made. And now Ralph takes us to the actual navigation room where it all happened years ago. Well, Ralph, this is pretty amazing. This was high-tech, what, back in the 1950s, maybe early 60s?
That was high-tech at least through the 60s. And this is a slide rule that we would use to determine distance or speed. You needed two inputs, time, distance, speed, and then you could pick up the others. No batteries involved here at all.
No batteries.
Nice, stick it
pretty
in your
amazing.
back pocket.
Well, now this is where you did all of the navigation technical work. I mean, figuring out where you were going, but you didn't have LORAN, GPS, all this special stuff.
No.
What did you use?
We didn't have GPS. We did have LORAN. LORAN was one of the devices that we used, although we weren't crazy about it because it really wasn't that easy to work with. We had radar.
Okay.
And we had our dead reckoning tracker here, which essentially just followed the ship's path based on time, speed, and direction.
So when we see those old pirate movies where they've got the slide rule out there and all that was the real deal.
Yeah, that was the real deal. As I said, very few batteries in any of the stuff we used.
Well, now this is interesting. That's a sextant.
Yeah, now
right?
this is a historical piece of equipment. This, of course, is a sextant. The technology itself is hundreds of years old. And we use these twice a day. Every morning and every evening we use these to shoot stars, which would then give us a star fix and a position, usually accurate within about 1.5 miles to 2 miles.
They are very accurate.
Now this particular sextant is very special to us here on the Hornet because this sextant belonged to Captain Lamb, who was our last XO and was XO during the Apollo recoveries. And this sextant was used to shoot the stars on the morning of the Apollo recovery to fix our position. And we have just recently gotten this back to the ship, and it's going to become part of a permanent display. So we're really proud of having this back.
Wow, that's wonderful. Now, this is actually where you worked during the Apollo 11 and 12 recovery. You actually worked here.
That's right.
Did all your figures.
That's right.
Amazing.
This is where we would take the information that we either got off the radar or off our celestial fix or off the LORAN, and then we would place our position on here. that information would be taken out to the bridge and actually marked on a small chart that they had on the bridge so that they could be informed of what our position was. Oftentimes the captain would come back here just to kind of see what was going on. But everything that you see in here was used to determine our position.
Okay, now did they actually have something like a depth finder? I mean, so you could actually track the bottom where you were going?
We did, and it's on the far side of the room here. And it was one more piece of information that we would use, because all the charts that you have show the depth of the water at particular locations. And so for us it was a confirmation. If we had a fix that put us in a particular place and we saw that the water was 700 fathoms deep, and we went to the fathometer and the fathometer said 300 fathoms deep, then we knew that we had messed up somewhere. Now that never happened, of course.
No, never.
But it was a confirmation that we would
And you could be in trouble real fast, right?
You could, of course, yeah. Depth on a big ship like this is critical.
And how deep does a ship actually?
The ship sits about 30 feet in the water.
Okay.
So it's not that deep. You would think maybe it's that deeper, but still, you don't want to run into anything.
Now, before modern-day laptops and other computers, it was done with mechanical devices. But believe it or not, they were in fact still computers, and they did a remarkable job without having the problems associated with modern computers.
This computer is an electromechanical computer that was actually built in about 1942. And it's a fascinating piece of equipment because it's not what you would think of most computers when you look at all these gears and grease and things down here. But this is something that we used all the time, and it gave us again a confirmation of what our position was. Did not take into account drift and wind, but it was really very accurate, and it helped us do the job. So even though it looks really old-fashioned, it really helped us in doing the job every day. Of course, getting this wheel back was a big part of the restoration of this bridge, which several of us had worked on for nearly 4 years. Things were missing. We had to contact other museum ships. We looked all over the place, historical societies, anywhere we could. But the wheel was the tough one, and the bridge wasn't finished till we got it back. So after nearly 4 years of work and 2 years of trying to get this wheel back, we finally did. And that was the last part of the bridge, and the bridge was finished. These are the sound-powered phones I was telling you about, and they essentially operate like 2 tin cans in a string. There's no electricity involved, and it's important because if you're in a combat situation and you lose power, you can still communicate with people in other areas of the ship. Right below us here is probably one of the more important pieces of equipment for us here in navigation. This is a radar repeater. It's a radar unit. And you may think of radar as only finding other ships at sea, but for our purpose, this radar would find landmarks, land, mountains, bridge tops, depending on how close you were. And we could measure the direction and the distance to those landmarks and then take that information over to the chart and determine a position. Most of the time we would like to have at least 2 or 3 different landmarks that we could measure and then take it to the chart and find our position that way. So this was particularly when you were close to land, or even more importantly if you were going into a harbor. This was an important piece of equipment for us in those days.
Next, we'll look behind the scenes in one of the most historically significant moments in the Hornet's history, the recovery of Apollo 11 and 12 space capsules. 6 men who made history by setting foot on our moon were recovered by this very ship, the USS Hornet.
This is recovery 1. I have 3 astronauts aboard, switching power frequency.
Well, Rolf, one of the things people think about recovery of an Apollo capsule as being, well, kind of everyday fare. I mean, you just set the coordinates, you go out there, you pick it up, and that's your job, right?
Right,
a little bit more involved than that. You were in Hawaii, but there was a lot more travel involved than just going to pick up the capsule.
Yeah, there really was. We had just come back from Vietnam, came to Long Beach. We had a change of command, so we had a brand new captain, and got the orders for Apollo and sailed to Hawaii towards the end of June. And about July 1st or 2nd, we headed down in the South Pacific, about 1,600 miles south of Hawaii, in order to be in an abort area, which is where the capsule would have come down if the mission would have failed. And once that had passed, then we began to move up towards the recovery area, and had nearly a week of practice during that time period. Dropping off a capsule that we had brought with us, an exercise practice capsule, sailing away, finding the capsule, coming back, sailing up next to it, stopping the ship in open ocean. This is almost a 50,000-ton aircraft carrier. Stopping it in open ocean next to the capsule, hooking onto the capsule, and bringing it aboard ship. That was a process that we had to practice over and over again for more than a week. And we had already practiced that a little bit off Hawaii as well. The day before the splashdown, things became quite complicated. We had come into a bad weather pattern, and we were now about 1,200 miles south of Hawaii, which was the recovery, primary recovery location. Sitting on station there, realizing the weather was bad, and ended up conferencing with those that would make the decision in Nassau, and changed the splashdown to nearly 300 miles north from where we were at that point. We were now just about 24 hours away from splashdown, and so we had here in navigation about 24 hours to set up the navigation, get us to that new location. And so the ship steamed at flank speed throughout the day and night in order to get us to that new splashdown point. And the navigation, because of the weather, and if you recall some of the really basic equipment that we had in those days, we did not have any good fixes at all. And so we were doing pretty much dead reckoning, which is real basic navigation. It's just time, speed, and direction. And with that dead reckoning, and then finally a good star fix on the morning of the recovery, we were able to be within just a few miles of the actual splashdown area.
Absolutely amazing. Was there a lot more people involved in that process than it was before?
Well, there weren't any more people involved in our department here as far as navigation, but everyone that was involved with the entire program became involved when we realized that we had to change positions, because obviously the trajectory of the capsule and all of that had to be changed as well, the splashdown point. And so an awful lot of people were involved in making that decision, which was initiated here on board ship. But as far as navigation, there was just that small group of us up here that now we, instead of being comfortably in position 24 hours before splashdown, now we had to make a rush, literally, for the new splashdown zone, nearly 300 miles to the north, and get on the position and wait for the president to come aboard and have the capsule splash, and then pick up the astronauts and eventually picking up the capsule. So what had been practiced over and over again, and the fact that we had a really great group of guys up here that just worked their butts off, we managed to get ourselves in position. Our captain had just trained the ship. Everyone responded just beautifully, and the ship was on position, and we picked up the astronauts and brought them safely back to Hawaii.
What an amazing career and an amazing event to be part of. It's part of history. What about when you're out there, though, in the middle of the ocean? You have nothing, no reference point. I mean, there's no buildings, there's no mountains, no trees. How do you know you're right where you say you are? I mean, doesn't this kind of go through your mind a little bit?
Well, obviously in those days we didn't have the type of sophisticated satellite navigation systems, GPS systems that we have today. You always start from a known point. I mean, you know where you are when you start, when you leave Long Beach or you leave San Diego, and under normal circumstances, you never lose that reference of always knowing where you are. And depending on where you're sailing, you use different equipment and different references. If you're close to land, within 100 or 200 miles of land, you have radar that you can use, which I talked about earlier. If weather conditions in those days, if the weather conditions were good, you had LORAN, which is a radio navigational system. And if you didn't have that, then hopefully you would have stars every morning and every evening at twilight that you could shoot and get your fix that way, which was really probably for us the most accurate, because we had some pretty good navigators aboard, including our department head, Captain Lamb, of course. If you lost all of that, then you reverted back to your very basic navigation skills, which is what I talked about earlier, which was called dead reckoning. And that simply meant that if you went in that direction for 1 hour at a certain speed, you knew where you started, you'd end up there if everything else worked out okay.
Amazing.
And so that's pretty much what we ended up doing.
What really changed it all for sailors today?
What changed it all for sailors today was this little device here. Yeah. And what's amazing is that sometimes on Saturdays I conduct tours up here for kids.
Right.
And we'll take them around, we'll show them all this great stuff in here, and we'll try to explain to them how we used to do all these things, slide rules without batteries, and sextants, and radars, and all this. And then at the end of my lecture, I pull out this little thing here. A little GPS unit. This particular device is made for sailors of small boats, and it'll tell you exactly where you're at within feet, constantly. And it'll also tell you how to get back to where you started. So this little guy here does everything we did in this room quicker and probably more accurately.
Not at all as glamorous.
Not as glamorous, And unfortunately, they probably wouldn't have needed the quartermaster as much as they did.
That's right. They really needed what you
They
knew.
needed us because we knew how to get them where they wanted to go. So
That's the way it works. Yeah. GPS, that's the way for me. I think I'll take my quartermaster course by internet and learn how to use the GPS.
There you go.
It works for me. Now remember this shot from the Apollo recovery film? You can see President Richard Nixon up there getting a really nice view of all the events. And Rolf was there that day, and he remembers it very well.
Well, for those of us that were able to get close enough to the President that morning, it was obvious that he was having a good day. He was excited to be aboard. He was jolly just about. He was on part of a world trip, and this little stop aboard a Navy carrier to watch the return of the first moon landing was obviously a really special event for him. Very jovial, and walked around, shook hands, said hi to quite a few folks. So for us it was really special. As I said, besides the fact that we were going to pick up the astronauts coming back from the moon, to have the President come aboard and come up here by the bridge and see him was really something for us at the time.
Thanks to my guest Ralph Sabie, former quartermaster on the USS Hornet, for being my guest on this episode of Northern California Journal. And be sure to watch further episodes as we explore this grand old ship, which now proudly honors the sacrifices and dedication of our valiant soldiers who have kept America free. Our hats are off to all of those who work behind the scenes to bring the story of the USS Hornet to new generations of young people and to help rekindle the memories of those who served aboard the Hornet. This is Raleigh Adams thanking you for stopping by to watch Northern California Journal.